The boys in the frame are named Neil and Edwin. Yes, they look like twin brothers, but in reality they're quite different. By the way, there was a third one, Michael Collins. He was hanging out somewhere around here. And this is Stanley, as in Kubrick. They say he was the one who filmed this whole thing. But first, it's important to explain that we're talking about the Apollo program. During one of the missions of this program, Apollo 11, on Princess Olga Memorial Day, July 24, 1969, Neil and Edwin landed on the surface of the moon. In total, there were 6 such missions, during which 12 people visited the moon. However, some unique individuals in the global community started arguing like stubborn beetles, claiming that such a thing couldn't have happened. They said it was all staged, that sort of thing. But eventually it seems everyone accepted it as a fact. You'd think people would just sit back and relax. But that same year, the New York Times published an article about the recent annual meeting of the Ku Klux. No, actually of a rather comical community dedicated to the memory of a man who would never fly. By the way, this took place in one of Chicago's bars. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But at one point, a tipsy NASA representative showed some members of this group photos of astronaut training activities that looked almost identical to footage from the moon. And that's when things really took off. One after another, some reputable authors began publishing books that questioned the moon landing. Even complete unknowns started gaining incredible popularity because it's quite easy to present a conspiracy theory. Most of these people, of course, were from Narushimov itself. And even though the entire local elite, including Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in open space on Saturn, watched the landing just as closely as everyone else, literally under a microscope. And despite clear evidence and recognition that the Americans really did it, and despite Alexei's own words about how deeply they cared for them, wishing them happiness, health, and all the best, people still refused to believe it. But you know what? The communist government was accused of being part of the conspiracy. Well, of course, it couldn't be any other way. People who literally didn't believe in anything claimed that the Soviet Union was supporting American fakes so that, in return, the Americans wouldn't expose the real number of Soviet cosmonaut deaths. There was even a legend that during subsequent missions, the Americans supposedly found the skeletons of Soviet suicide cosmonauts who had come to repair the lunar tractors there, but couldn't return because they lacked the necessary technology. Obviously, this is complete nonsense, since there are no putrefactive bacteria on the surface of the moon. It turns out that the authors of those very books poured out facts that a fairly large number of people believed in because they seemed to be stronger and more convincing than any logic. Neil was the first to exit the module. Here, people latched onto the footprint, since it didn't match the sole of the spacesuit on display in the museum. For some reason, this fact is still considered an irrefutable argument by some. But the lack of rational thinking has turned it into an absolute. In reality, though, the footprint was left by a different spacesuit, which was worn when stepping onto the surface. It was sturdier, warmer, and carried more oxygen on board. But that's not all. Conspiracy theorists thought that the footprint was, surprisingly, too clear. But why is that? There is no air on the moon, so the grains don't collide and therefore have irregular shapes. In any case, it's rougher and coarser than ordinary sand. So water isn't needed. Halya can take a break. Then the astronauts planted a flag, another flag, a pennant, an olive branch, and a medal for the pride and hope of the school. That's right, everyone focused on the flag. Supposedly, since there's no air on the moon, it shouldn't be able to hang like that. But unfortunately for them, it absolutely can. The thing is, the flagpole wasn't just L-shaped. It also supported the flag with a mesh so it would hang properly. Next came the stars, or rather, their absence. Nonsense. Fake America, as always, staged a fake. Here's a photo of a Soviet probe, and there aren't any Americans at all. They made them up just to scare the Soviet public. Are people in tinfoil hats really so dumb that they seriously thought if Stanley Kubrick had filmed all this in a Hollywood studio, he would have forgotten to paint in the stars? By the way, any photographer can debunk this claim. It's all about the exposure. It's simply impossible to photograph 2 bright objects at different distances at the same time. Of course, nowadays there are technologies for combining images. Back then, there was no such thing. There were only 2 options. Either you could see the stars and the moon was overexposed, or vice versa. After the end of the Apollo program, no one flew to the moon anymore. But why? The answer is extremely simple. First of all, it's an extremely expensive endeavor, and secondly, what is there to do? During the space race, NASA's funding made up as much as 5% of America's annual budget. That's a lot. Now it's only 0.5%. They say that maybe they'll return to the moon in 2024. After all, once again, there's nothing to study there, unless it's to build a foothold for exploring Mars. One way or another, for most people, space, science, and real progress are all the same. Nobody really cares. Modern Homo sapiens Valerie just needs a modern iPhone, a dozen genders, a startup, preferably a coffee shop, verbal battles for ecology, and support for anyone except themselves. The market, competition, and ideological struggle, all of these are indisputable and the most effective engines of progress. However, right now, we are observing and degrading. Good luck to you, Mr. Kinski.